Privacy has never been a straightforward topic, yet may be found as a distinct, yet related cluster of things. Data privacy in particular is a rapidly growing ethical consideration that continues to spiral out of proportion with the quantity of considerations that are introduced amongst the evolutions of technology, and therefore the evolution of software, and ultimately new concepts of data privacy which previously would not have been a concern with previous technologies. And therefore, imperatively, new ideas introduced in technologies are then followed by new societal opinions and public standards to the boundaries in defining privacy. Of course, with the possibilities that technology is capable of achieving and accomplishing, with the ease of obtaining one's complete personal information as an example, there are to be parameters that are placed to ensure that privacy is protected. However, not to the point that applications may require verification via certain private information, which is needed for such applications to operate. Emails, social media, online event signups, and what we'll soon discuss, navigation. But as mentioned, all of these require some sort of private information that is required in order for there to be a service that actually delivers its intended purpose, and theoretically should only be obtaining private information that is actually required for the service. Nothing more, nothing less. But of course, that is certainly not the reality of it all. There is a large strain. The strain between what is actually privacy access used for the required services and what information is provided by users of these services, but aren't required for that service and is within that service's database. The example of those, well, I'll get to those soon. But looking at it from a wider scope, isn't it illegal? You'd be thinking that. How have they gotten away with it? Are there laws in place? Well, yeah, there are laws in place that do exist. Australia has the Privacy Act 1988, Commonwealth, and specifically in the Australia Privacy Principles 1 to 6 in Schedule 1 of the Act, which mentions the idea of notice and consent, to which consent must be given by the user for the access of private information. Personal information, as per this Act, further defines this as information or an opinion about an identified individual or an individual who's reasonably identifiable. Whether the information is true or not, whether the information is recorded in a material form or not. Moreover, sensitive information, example race, ethnicity, health, genetic and biometric. So, if we as the user aren't allowing these services to access our additional information, then how do they do it? Well, that's the thing. The thing is, we do allow them to access our information. Ever heard of a Tease and Sieze? Well, if you don't know what Tease and Sieze is, it's also the name of this podcast. Very well named, right? If you don't know what Tease and Sieze is, then I'm guessing you're part of the population who would be the ones swiping past and simply pressing accept at every point in order to start the service or application that you had just installed. Terms and conditions, as per the ACCC, set out the rights and responsibilities of each party, and there are certain consumer rights that always exist under the law, which the T's and C's cannot take away when written, including the inability of displaying a refund sign, saying they aren't responsible for problems with the product or service, and the inability to suggesting the consumer must sign an extended warranty to avoid losing these basic rights after a certain date, as it is against the law for businesses to mislead consumers about their rights in these ways. Now, there are abundance of loopholes around these protections to easily breach the protections of privacy, which the law provides both from the Privacy Act and the monitoring of the ACCC through the ambiguities of the T's and C's. Certain phrasings, words which may infer other meanings, and may also have whole new meanings when really deepened. And yes, that's a common theme in the future discussions when we're looking at the T's and C's throughout this upcoming episode. Above the entire privacy concerns are the agreements to simply put odd conditions, which, whilst may not necessarily harm the user, may certainly cause inconveniences if the user finds those abnormalities in the T's and C's and tries to dispute it. And you're going to see there's a lot of issues when it comes to trying to dispute the privacy policies in T's and C's. What's stranger though is that the law allows a consent exception for government agencies under a separate part of the direct collection rule, but not for private organizations. From there, private companies, as we can infer from the way so many of our contents across applications seem to be similar in these organizations, what's evident is that they share information across different companies and tend to be very vague about who they share our information with and who they got it from. One of the companies that we will be investigating, Google, is included in admitting the collection of personal information from third parties, but are vaguer about the nature of that information. Of course, it is not in the exception of users that the information would be collected by third parties. But hey, like I said, how many of us are really reading the T's and C's? In 2020, of the 67% Australians who had read terms and conditions at some point within that 12-month period of 2020, 69% of them reported accepting terms even though they were not comfortable with them, with the majority, 75% of them, accepting them as it was the only way to access the product or service. This was the Australian government, by the way, that did these statistics. So even if Australians see the danger of acceptance of private company terms and conditions, you could say possibly social norms and the popularity of the applications are what have Australians accepting such terms regardless of the dangers that are hidden within the terms and conditions in terms of breach of privacy. That perfectly aligns with a concept known across the entirety of security engineering. The notion that human beings, we are the weakest link to protecting the security of humans online. The question begs though, how dangerous is it to simply accept terms and conditions for our privacy? How much of our information is actually used for the service? And how much is actually taken without its need for the service? Where does that extra information go? Well, to introduce in what scope we will look at this at, let's take a look through a brief history of navigation and navigation applications. GPS technology appeared for the first time in a cell phone in 1999, and by 2000, in the US, the government ended the Selective Availability Program, which initially only allowed GPS for military use, making GPS signals 10 times more accurate overnight. Basically, they allowed the satellites to be accessible to everybody, to the public. Looking back at it, I kind of find it insane that military technology would be given for free to the public. But as the saying goes, free isn't free. If you aren't paying for it, you and your data are the product being sold. And as you know, with navigation applications, it's your location. Now, with mobile access to GPS, and more importantly, the halting of selective availability to GPS information, C++ coders and programmers began their work on navigating applications for the public. As independently coded and produced, of course, the lack of agency by the government would mean that so long as the T's and C's complied with national law, the applications could obtain any data that the user may agree to by simply pressing the terms and conditions button and thus begins the war on privacy within navigation applications. Upon our research for the top navigation applications, 3 major applications continue to appear in my searches: Google Maps, Waze, and Apple Maps. As I tried to look for figures for installments or any sort of number that would tell me exactly how many people use certain navigation applications, I could not find figures. But simply put, these applications were the big 3 in navigation apps. That being the aforementioned 3. And if that is the case, then that is where I shall embark on my mission. My mission to uncover what we actually agree to when accepting terms and conditions of the big 3 navigation apps. The private data that is being taken from us as we agree to these terms and conditions, and where that data may be heading. So, let's begin. We can start off with the one that is the most reviewed navigation application on the Apple App Store, with 495k reviews at 4.6 stars. It's quite a lot. Google Maps. Extensively, Google Maps is an extension of Google, the world's most popular search engine. Well, arguably not much of a search engine anymore with its use of Gemini, so it's almost simply like an AI chatbot. But the larger implications developing from the notion that Google owns Google Maps, following its purchase of a C++ desktop program that was, fun fact, made in Sydney between 2003 and 2004, the terms and conditions extend beyond Google Maps itself and into simply owning a Google account or Gmail. Uniquely, Google Maps is not just operated as an installable software product, but also accessible via web browser, making it uniquely separate from the 2 other applications, elucidating the Google macrosphere beyond an application, but a whole ecosystem of information which Google potentially has of their user. With the additional applications of Drive, Docs, Slides, Calendar, and additionally much more, YouTube, the privacy of the user that may be breached goes beyond the maps and spans entirely across the entire account. So without further ado, let's take a look at the terms and conditions, and more imperatively, specific to privacy. As a framework for each navigation tool, we will first look at the terms and conditions as a whole, and then critically analyze the privacy policy of each company. Now, when looking at terms and conditions, oftentimes there is a similar framework of accessing service agreements, payment terms, licensing, customer obligations and consequences, and technical support services. And especially for a company as large as Google, all that appears to be by the book, from what I've seen. And importantly, by the law. And so far it does comply with the ACCC regulations of terms and conditions. A lot of it is also talking about the responsibility of the user, and simply ground rules for the user when using the application, which is completely reasonable. Funnily enough, due to Google Maps being an extension to Google, the app must include the title of in-app purchases title, and thus the payment section of the terms of conditions, due to the existence of Drive and Gmail, which offer purchases for extended storage. Although the layperson may be misinformed into thinking of the existence of purchases for certain features of Google Maps when installing it, maybe causing some sort of a misunderstanding. But as aforementioned, the majority of the terms and conditions are rather for the user to ensure that they do not exploit the application in a way that may cause cyber harm or malicious activity assisted by their use of Google Maps and Google applications in general. Where I find the interesting condition applied to those agreeing to Google Maps T's and C's is within the miscellaneous section, where it mentions all claims arising out of or relating to this agreement or the services will be governed by California law, excluding that state's conflict of law rules, and will be litigated exclusively in the federal or state courts of Santa Clara County, California, USA. The parties consent to personal jurisdiction in those courts. In other words, you have any issues with Google Maps T's and C's that you want to dispute against Google directly? Well, start packing your bags and start researching the US justice system. Because you're going to have to make a trip to the courts in California in order to make your case. I think what makes this a concern is what is to come, and that is the concerns that could be found in privacy policy. And any dispute you'd like to make against the potential harms of the privacy policy will monumentally be expensive, considering travel, especially if you're coming from Australia, like us. With enough background on Tease and Sieze, I think it's time that we look at the privacy policy. Google happens to separate the privacy policy from the Google Maps T's and C's as an external link that redirects you to a page on Google's privacy policy for all Google accounts use, and any Google service involving the use of a Google account. Makes sense. This establishes the aforementioned nature of Google's expansive cover of the internet, including your Google Chrome, which is a concern because that margins as the most used internet browser in the world in holding 65 to 70% of the total global market share. Hence, by agreeing to simply own a Google account, you automatically agree to the policy of Google Maps too, as it applies through all Google services. The privacy policy begins with a clear message to the reader, as says, "When you use our services, you trust us with your information. We understand this is a big responsibility and work hard to protect your information and put you in control." Now, this privacy policy is meant to help you understand what information we collect, why we collect it, how you can update, manage, export, and delete your information. Now, right away, Google outlines their responsibilities as a company to protect your data, and to also let the reader know about their autonomy to choose what information that can be shared and removed, and how to remove information, almost as if this privacy policy secondarily is a guide for users to privacy with Google. Despite the entitled responsibility of Google, regardless of their position and responsibility, what concerns is the type of information provided, and what could potentially happen to it from being in the Google database. Google explicitly mentions your activity as being collected data in your activity section. It says, "We collect information about your activity in our services, which we use to do things like recommend a YouTube video you might like. The activity information we collect may include terms you search for, videos you watch, views and interactions with content and ads media, like images, files, audio, and video from your interactions, purchase activity, people with whom you communicate or share content, activity on third-party sites and apps that may use our services, Chrome browsing history you've synced with your Google account, if you use our services to make and receive calls or send messages and receive messages. We may collect call and message log information like your phone number, call party number, receiving party number, forwarding numbers, sender and recipient email address, time and date of calls and messages, duration of calls, routing information, and types and volumes of calls and messages." Now, a lot of this does not sound related to Google Maps, but I want you to imagine yourself looking at Google Maps and thinking that you'd want to install it and gain access to some of the services within Google Maps, such as location search history and recent location searches, which are only available through the creation of a Google account. And in this scenario, you are making a Google account solely to use Google Maps. And let's assume you don't have a Google account. Let's say you're an Outlook warrior. Well, just from the appeal of Google Maps, you have automatically agreed to the terms of Google account to give all of this data to Google. and all of these permissions to Google. Relevant to the navigation application is the section under your location information. Wow, and this is where it gets crazy. GPS and other sensor data from your device, IP address, activity on Google services, such as from your searches or places you label like home or work, information about things near your device, such as Wi-Fi access points, cell towers, and Bluetooth-enabled devices. These are all things that Google can access, location related. So, if you use Google's location services on Android, we can improve the services. We can improve the performances of apps that rely on your location, like Google Maps. If you use Google's location services, your device sends information to Google about its location. Sensors like accelerometer and nearby cell towers and Wi-Fi access points like MAC address and signal strength. All these things help to determine your location. You can use your device settings to enable Google location services. I mean, to be honest, these accesses are quite a lot. Are they all really necessary for the use of Google Maps, just wanting to get your location? I mean, IP address? Wi-Fi access points? I mean, in the scenario that you're using offline Google Maps, and then you connect to Wi-Fi, it should be the device that you use that has knowledge of the Wi-Fi access point, and not the application itself. As the device then gains online connectivity for the application to then update. Therefore, I don't think, and it should not be, necessary for applications for Google Maps specifically to attain that ability. Ultimately though, Google Maps is an extension of Google after all. So maybe other services within Google may need that permission, but not Google Maps. Certainly not Google Maps. I also make the assumption that this unneeded access stretches to Google Maps though, as the privacy policy simply generalizes the permissions as for all services, and not naming specific services that have specific permissions in accepting the privacy policy. With the unnecessarily extensive provided private data given to Google, and their initial promise to protect your information and put you in control, Google provides in the privacy policy as to when Google shares your information. With your consent, we'll share personal information outside of Google when we have your consent. We also provide you with controls to review and manage third-party apps and sites that you have given access to data in your Google account. We'll ask for your explicit consent to share any personal information. Now, from a Maps perspective, I think there is not too much to enclose as an issue, but as a Google account there would be concern, as what constitutes as consent could be something as easy as a misclick of a button on the internet. A human error albeit, yet one that programmers and online services can exploit to get harmful consent that, despite feeling like an unauthoritarian action, is completely legal under the Privacy Act 1988 Commonwealth, and specifically in the Australia Privacy Principles 1 to 6 in Schedule 1, as a harm does not necessarily constitute to the breaking of law. Now we move on to their legal reasons of sharing personal information under their For Legal Reasons title. For legal reasons, we will share personal information outside of Google if we have good faith belief that disclosure of the information is reasonably necessary to respond to any applicable law, regulation, legal process, or enforceable government request. We share information about the number and type of requests we receive from governments in our transparency report. Enforce applicable terms of service, including investigation of potential violations. Detect, prevent, or otherwise address fraud, security, or technical issues. protect against harms to the rights, property, or safety of Google, our users, or the public. Now, the framework which defines good faith belief, whilst initially may be perceived as a subjective term without any regulations or regulatory manual to abide by, it does in fact comply with the concept of bona fide in law, which in contract is binding. However, the lay individual who reads this may not understand such concepts, and may feel insecurity with the terms, and therefore may cause unnecessary dispute between the user and Google. And as we talked about already, if it becomes an unnecessary dispute, then they're going to have to pack their bags, go all the way to Santa Clara, California, and dispute a case that was always a losing case to begin with. So I think they should be a bit clearer with these terms and what they mean. Provide the definitions, And overall, this is a defining issue. It's a primary issue with Google Maps in its terms and conditions, that it has a lack of defining certain terms, such as consent and good faith belief, and therefore may be accepted or disputed by users by their interpretations of the terms. Moreover, in the case of disputes, it may become an economic burden for the user having the need to travel and possibly hire a lawyer who is knowledgeable on the California jurisdiction of law, which may also make the user undoubtedly reluctant to dispute any concerns, having to simply accept all terms due to the cost of fighting for the dispute. And when we're looking at terms, there are things that you could dispute, like the definitions, the lack of definitions. So a trip to California might be something that people may actually do just to dispute Google and the terms and conditions. So it's not out of the picture at all. But what happens when you have a company that also follows the same jurisdictions, but are clear in defining their terms and conditions? Well, let's take a look at Apple Maps. Distinctly, the Apple Maps terms and conditions are quite concise, and from a user's perspective, is very easy to read. The main concern in these terms and conditions is the altering of maps to commit cyber harms or cyber-assisted violence, including harassment, abuse, stalking, trespassing, or scrutinizing the application itself. Apple, in terms of its controlling law for its Apple Maps, is similar to Google as it mentions. These terms of use will be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of California, excluding its conflict of law principles. You agree to the personal jurisdiction by and venue in the state and federal courts in Santa Clara County, California, and waive any objection to such jurisdiction or venue. If for any reason a court of competent jurisdiction finds any provision or portion thereof to be unenforceable, the remainder of these terms of use shall continue in full force and effect. Now, you can see, it appears that the jurisdiction of California is a very common jurisdiction that big tech companies appear to abide by. But as the first state law addressing online privacy protections, the California Online Privacy Protection Act is justified as the reasonable choice for big tech firms as their choice of governed jurisdiction for their terms and conditions. So to Google about the whole entire California thing, I apologize, but at the same time, please make your terms more clearer. Anyways, as aforementioned, there is the limitation of any disputes which users may have with the company, or the company may have with the user. The user will have to take the case to California, which may be an economic liability for the user. And just as Google does, Apple provides a separate link to the privacy policy, which is accepted as you accept terms and conditions for Apple Maps. This implies the privacy policy applying for all Apple devices, technologies, and applications are a similar nature to Google. However, the link in fact redirects you actually, to the official store website, which has an entire page dedicated to the privacy features of Apple. And to my own surprise, Apple in fact prides itself on the privacy features which it procures. In fact, it has a visual which talks about its advantages for privacy over what Google has to offer with Chrome. And one in particular, which caught my eye, was Apple's ability to hide your IP address from known trackers, which for me was a pressing issue when looking at Google Maps' limitations. The page also holds a visual specific for each Apple specialized application and how your privacy is protected, including for Apple Maps. And this is what it says. Where you go says a lot about you. Maps delivers a great experience without Apple knowing which stores, neighborhoods, or clinics you visit. And because Maps doesn't require a sign-in, where you go isn't associated with your Apple account at all. Many personalized features like visited places or locating your parked car are created on your device. Data used to improve navigation such as routes or search terms is not associated with your identity. Instead, that information is based on random identifiers that are constantly changing. Wow. I just want to emphasize the idea of not needing to sign in and the disassociation of Maps application with your Apple account, unlike the binding link of Google Maps with your Google account. The use of device stored information rather than the notion of saving it on a cloud is the autonomy that allows users to not worry about the information on location history being leaked by trackers and malicious users online. So as you scroll towards the bottom of the page, you find the PDF to view the formal privacy policy, which leads to another redirecting link to that PDF. The PDF is a lay user of Apple products sort of manual, where like the everyday person is able to understand, and has been made easy to read with its title being A Day in the Life of Your Data. It provides specific scenarios across their Apple exclusive apps as to how Apple protects the data of the lay user, including specific protections to privacy provided in Apple Maps and general location, boasting their feature on how location data on Apple Maps would have been linked to a random identifier, which is regularly reset and not linked to the user. Moreover, users would be periodically reminded of which apps are accessing their location in the background. So additional to the boasting of their privacy features, Apple actually tells users what typically occurs on other devices if you enable location permissions. They state in the form of a scenario in a typical daily life of the pseudonym John. There are 4 apps on John's phone collecting and tracking their location data periodically in the background. After the data has been extracted from the device, Apple developers sell it to a host of obscure third-party data brokers that John never heard of. Although the location data is claimed to be anonymous, user tracking allows data brokers to match John's location history from these apps with information collected from his use of other apps. This means information tracked across different apps and from multiple sources is available for any company or organization to purchase and could be used to create a comprehensive profile about him that includes his precise day-to-day movements. I like the way that Apple is using scenarios to allow users to better understand how their data is breached in an impeccable example of increasing digital literacy as a means to protect your product, as a means to promote your product, in fact. As a means to promote your product whilst guaranteeing that your product won't make the same mistakes. Alongside the PDF lies further context as to what certain parts of the scenario imply or further facts about the information provided in the scenario, including the idea that some apps request to more data than is required to provide their service, such as a keyboard app requesting precise location access, or the exchange of information can go to advertising networks, advertising publishers, attribution and measurement providers, data brokers, other private companies, and even governmental organizations. And then provided at the bottom of the PDF are the sources of research and literature backing their points and concerns for the breach of data, making this privacy policy technically a hybrid between privacy protection information and a synthesis on privacy breach online. To be quite honest, as an avid Google Maps user, I definitely did not expect the walls and layers of protection that Apple Maps and Apple wholly provides to ensure the security of your privacy. Going out of their way to provide online security safety guidelines that even the lay user may understand within their privacy policy, it astounds me, honestly. Like, overall, Apple Maps, despite not having the popular reputation that the other two navigation apps have, seems to be convincingly wary of ensuring the protection of data, in ensuring that they only take data necessary to run their services, and being very clear in defining those terms about it as well. And moreover, with the data that they have been provided by the user, to then ensure layers of protection by learning from the drawbacks of other navigational and technological companies. And that's why they give the scenarios. So overall, Apple, I think you're doing a really good job of protecting the privacy of users. And I think these terms and conditions couldn't be much clearer. So, good on you. Unfortunately, this next navigation app, I'm not sure I can say quite the same. Now, right off the bat, Waze is currently the #1 navigation application on the App Store, with a 4.8 star rating. Now, even more intriguing, when looking up Waze's terms and conditions, it pops up under Google's support website. With a bit of research, you will find that Google had bought Waze for $1.15 billion. At the time, the highest price ever paid for a consumer app. Thus, as Waze has its own application, it shares its data across to Google. And the acquired owner of Waze is Google. That should arise some red flags for the case that any breach to Google will inadvertently affect Waze users, which further begs the question, what makes Google Maps and Waze different? That difference will become apparent with a deeper dive into their terms and conditions that users accept as they use the app. In a similar fashion to the previous two navigation applications, the contract begins with terms that comply with the ACCC and the Privacy Act Commonwealth, that the user does not abuse the app for any cyber harm or cyber facilitated harm, basically going through what users should not do with the app, ensuring that they don't cause any crimes, right, or any harms. Although prior to all that, the terms and conditions emphasize the nature of Waze as a business first. As Waze says, it gives you permission to access and use the service so long as you comply with these terms, which reflect how Waze's business works. We make the service free of charge to anyone. Advertising is what makes it possible to offer our service to anyone, to everyone. Is that not fishy to anybody? Advertising? On a navigation app? What advertising? Well, the answer to that is that Waze as a navigation app, by the way, places ads on your screens as you navigate through with the Google Ads campaign platform. The ads will be linked to Google Places results and launch the user to the ad location preview page when clicked, which sources Google data. So, teaming up with Google, who by the way use personal data to recommend your preferences, through your Google search history and past locations, is used to place ads of places which you pass by on the road. I mean, is that not a risk for harm for ads to pop up whilst you're navigating on the road, whilst you're driving? Like you're driving and all of a sudden, boom, notification pops up. Is that not a risk to harm, you know? It's kind of crazy. Another thing to note is the way that Waze describes itself as a business, different from Google as a service and Apple as an integrated Apple exclusive application for navigation. In essence, the money is essential. And with the money coming from the advertisements on screen, you can almost perceive Waze as an advertising board that just happens to have navigational features. It almost sounds like a joke. It becomes a bigger joke when they place the warning in their terms to not attempt to view or click on any ads while operating on a vehicle in full caps, further solidifying its nature as simply an ad board which the users are not permitted to interact with, by the way, for some reason, even though they recommend clicking on the ads, which pops up to Google services and whatnot. And it just happens to be accompanied with navigational features. That's what Waze basically is. It's kind of absurd, I can't lie. And I think the wildest part of Waze, which other than the programmer and creator of the app originating from there, is the idea of the governing law and jurisdiction. As they state, these terms will be governed solely by the laws of the State of Israel, without giving effect to any conflicts of law principles. Any dispute, claim, or controversy arising out of, connected with, or relating to these terms and the service will be under the exclusive jurisdiction of the competent court in Tel Aviv district in Israel. For me, why it does not make sense to me is that with Google and Apple, it's justifiable for them to choose the California jurisdiction as a leading jurisdiction to the reform of law in keeping up with technological advancements, which is something that many courts globally fail to accomplish because technological advancements rapidly evolve faster than any legislation can catch up with. But at the very least, the California jurisdiction of Santa Clara seems to be doing the best they can, and that's why big tech firms like to team up and be under the jurisdiction of Santa Clara, California. However, for Waze, it seems like they're doing this just simply out of convenience, that their creator of Waze originates from there. But it keeps its jurisdiction of law as solely Israel, considering its base of operations based there. As the bottom of the terms and services, by the way, it still says that they're still based there, even though they're bought out by Google. It displays contact details and an address running back to Tel Aviv. So Waze clearly prioritizes what is deemed convenient for them. I mean, through the advertisements that bring them the money. It's basically a business, like they said, it's a business. So they prioritize what's deemed convenient for them over the customer care and the service for the customer, and therefore concerns the privacy of the user, which, by the way, we have not even touched the privacy policy yet, and look at all these issues we have with the terms and conditions. So, concerningly, to settle any dispute, and I'd argue this is much harder than going to Santa Clara, California, I mean, for obvious reasons, whether it be the user disputing the terms and conditions of Waze, or Waze bringing a user to court for the violation of their terms and conditions to facilitate harm, they would have to make a trip to Israel, as Waze is under the exclusive, keyword is exclusive, and solely under the jurisdiction of the court of Tel Aviv, the district court in Israel, which is a major accessibility limitation and economic loss on the user having to fund the travel. Now, moving on to privacy policy, which, mimicking the previous navigation apps, Google Maps and Apple Maps, it is a separate link which opens up to a new tab to their privacy policy, and just as the previous link, this is also under the website of Google support. Now, under the section of information we collect as you use our services, of course, as a navigation application, it mentions detailed location, travel, and route information. However, under that subheading, it specifies the inclusion of your voice and audio information anytime you use the voice and audio features. Now, for me, that's kind of concerning because questions the privacy of the user, as Waze separates voice and audio features as two separate entities. Thus, bears the question, how often does Waze listen to our voice when we enable microphone features on Waze? Are they always listening? I don't know about you, but sometimes I'd be talking about things and then suddenly ads pop up about the things I literally just spoke about 10 seconds ago. And if Waze is prioritizing the business, of course they want to personalize the ads to things that I am interested in. So, hey, that's kind of a privacy concern that we are not given clear terms as to how often they listen to us. So, please let us know, Waze. Yeah, please. Furthermore, to opt out of Waze, it mentions that the only way is through account deletion, which yeah, as most companies should be doing, informs the user on how to do so, which Waze does. However, unlike Google, which mentioned that they will remove information, the information you provide on Waze is not guaranteed to be removed with the deletion of your Waze account, unlike Apple Maps and somewhat with Google Maps. Now, more importantly and more concerningly, which is why I mentioned the aforementioned point, is that Waze mentions under the when Waze shares your information section that they would share your information if Waze reasonably believes that it is required by law to share or disclose your information. Now, I need you to look at the wording here, reasonably believes. It's different to Google's good faith belief, because good faith belief directly translates to bona fide, which is the contractually binding by law, like term. Whereas reasonably believe, it's not really directly connected to that concept and therefore lies in the space of subjectivity. Privacy, as a result then, faces a great compromise when in the hands of subjectivity, which is exactly inferred from the wording of this privacy policy. And honestly, from the privacy policy, this set of sentences that I'm about to say basically summarizes the lackluster care for the user as being primarily a business, which Waze states, we store data on servers located around the world. And your information may be processed on servers located outside the country where you live. Data protection laws may vary amongst countries, with some providing more protection than others. So, it does not matter to Waze, or seem to be a concern for Waze, that there are servers across the world which your data is stored, where depending on which country you're from, you may be protected more than others. It almost sounds like they're offloading any potential breach towards the responsibility of the countries which the user originates from, rather than taking the accountability themselves of any issues, as they simply just store the data globally. They're like, oh yeah, we store it globally, but the protection of that, that depends on your country. So yeah, leaving the responsibility of protection to the countries themselves, which feels very lackluster. Like I said earlier, like they just don't care. They just store data, and if it's not protected, then whoopsie doopsie, not my fault. That's how Waze is basically saying this in their terms and conditions. And like a lack of standardization in the regulations for those who will read these terms will right away sense a red flag that Waze is not in it for the care of the users, but simply as a business providing their clients with a navigation app which, well, very funnily plays ads for their business, without a care of the safety of users, with contradictory nature of cautioning drivers to ignore ads, which Waze themselves pop up onto the screens. Like, it's genuinely a joke, man. And like, if I were to describe it with one word, shady. Personally, shady is the best way to describe Waze. Despite it being the #1 app for navigation on App Store, on Apple, like, I find that so insane. Like, 4.8 stars. Like, yeah, sure, like, I guess you're getting to your destination faster, that's the reputation it has. But at a privacy perspective, there's a lot of concerns. With a lack of transparency and lack of assurance of user care, which Apple had successfully provided in their terms. If you compare it to Apple, Apple is like levels beyond this. And a lack of confidently sound and evidence-based governing body like Google and Apple apply for their jurisdiction of law, as Waze simply chose what was convenient for business benefits over the customer needs. And I say customer needs as the user interacting with the app is simply for the goal of making money via unwarranted appearing ads, which are only really happening because the user, at the end of the day, had agreed to these terms of the application. I mean, hey, look, as long as you get to your destination faster, privacy fully compromised. Waze is just, it's just not that guy, man. Get off Waze. That's my advice. And I guess it's time to get onto the final verdict. And before saying anything, I think imperatively, a message to the listeners, I will definitely say, please, 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 please read the terms and conditions of any service that you click upon the internet. Like, just, it won't take more than 5 minutes. I can assure you that spending those 5 minutes is beyond the value of potential breach of privacy and a lack of user protection. That being said, from the findings, I mean, I made it quite obvious already, but I do not recommend the use of Waze. That's at the bottom. That's at the bottom of the navigation list, albeit it's high rating on App Store. Put it simply, your data is scattered across the world. You basically cannot dispute the app considering its legal jurisdiction, and it's ultimately a business first, before a service for its users, prioritizing monetization over the user needs. Like, what more can I say? That's more enough of a red flag than anything for privacy concerns. And with its link to Google, I therefore put Google Maps in the middle of the three. To be honest, the Google terms and conditions are pretty solid. I mean, they're by the book, and that's to be expected by it's $1 trillion company actually. And I further commend its use of honesty, especially highlighted in its good faith belief structure, as intervening with private information. However, the ambiguity in its definition of the user giving consent and its large database nature stemming across and permissions intersecting across a broader range of Google services. Your private data from Google Maps may be compromised from an angle which may be completely unprecedented, in the form of attackers hacking another angle in the form of targeting a different service on Google. So if at any moment the user's Google account becomes compromised, this breach affects everything from your Gmail, from your Drive, from your YouTube account, and of course, what we're looking at today, your Google Maps, right? Including your map history and therefore the accompanying nature of the Maps account being binded to the rest of Google. And that entire, identity that the Maps is binded to your Google account poses a security concern. And it is for that lack of link that Apple Maps has, is the reason why Apple Maps is the top of this map hierarchy. And it makes sense from the explanation I said earlier. It emphasizes security privacy of users on Apple Maps. And its constant reshuffle of random identifiers that are constantly changing to hide your location and information, that's definitely a major factor to keeping the disclosure of personal info on Apple Maps. Lastly, unlike Waze and Google, there is not necessarily an Apple account that needs to be linked to unlock all features of Apple Maps, and is accessible without the use of an account. And location search history will be kept on the phone's local drive, and not an online cloud like Waze and Google, which definitely lessens the risk of private history exposure. I personally, I was not a fan of Apple Maps' UI or software, but at the end of the day, we're assessing this from a safety perspective, a cyber safety perspective, a security perspective, and a privacy protection perspective, most importantly. And if we're assessing on those terms and conditions, to be honest, if it means that my privacy and information is secure in exchange for a slightly lesser quality UI than Google Maps, I mean, I'll probably take that any day. I'd rather be 2 minutes late than have my entire information compromised. So yeah, Apple Maps, you take the win. Congratulations. You are the best. And the way that you advertise your privacy, I'm surprised. I'll say it again, I'm surprised. So congratulations, Apple Maps. You are the best navigation app in protecting privacy. And let's hope you don't get teased and seized by Tease and Sieze. Have a good day.